Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have fully regained the initiative across the front line. They have managed to secure the flanks in the Toretsk direction. The Russians continued offensive operations to the southwest of Pokrovsk, northwest of Kurakhove, as well as in the northern section of the Velika Novosilka section of the front line. The Russians also continued advances in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, across the Serebets and Usk river lines in the east, and additional advances within the Sumy region in the north. The Ukrainians have been unable to develop the offensive operations further in the Belgorod direction. Neither have they been able to advance further within the direction of Toretsk. Instead, the Russians have secured the flanks and stabilized the situation and regained the initiative. The Russians have also managed to gain control over a significant fortified stronghold of the Ukrainians, encircling some of their forces. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to gain control over the remaining residential area of Lobkova in the northwestern parts of the town, gaining full control of it. They've also managed to gain control over several forest lines and fields to the southwest of Lobkova, gaining control over a fortified position of the Ukrainians, and slowly advancing towards the town of Kamyanske. The Russians are here developing the offensive operations in the direction of Kamyanske from the eastern direction through Lobkova and from the southern direction through the forest lines and fields to the southeast of the town, until they manage to match up the front line with the east and the south to then also control the western parts and move onwards to gain full control over the southern flank of the river line, and then move onwards through the high ground through the fortified positions towards the northern parts of it. For this, they need to gain control over the areas here in between Stepove and Lobkova, where we see that the Russians are moving to pincer the Ukrainian fortified positions and encircle them through a push from the northwest of Stepove and from the southwest through Lobkova to the northeast, where they'll look to cut off the Ukrainian positions within the forest lines in between the two villages. To the east, the Russians have managed to advance in several areas, from Bohdanivka in the north to Vesele in the south. The Russians gained full control over Vesele and the fortified positions within the town to the southwest and northwest of it. The Russians are now fighting over the fortified positions just outside the town to the northwest and in the direction of Fedorivka on the western bank of the Mokry Yali river line, allowing them to secure a road across the Dragon Teeth fortified alliance. However, the Ukrainians still have strong fortified positions near these towns. The Russians still have to struggle for quite a while before they properly establish themselves across the defensive line. But fighting has now moved on to the fortified positions northwest of Vesele, which is the gateway for the Russian forces to move onwards along the fortified line beyond that of the Dragon Teeth line, which will begin the final battle over the remaining fortified positions in the southwest of the Donetsk region. The Russians also managed to advance north of Rusliv, gaining control over several forest lines and a gas station to the east of Behatir. With this, the Russians have reached the outskirts of the town, where the next operation will be to gain a foothold within it and fortified positions to the south of it. Before this, they'll likely advance further to the south of the town, where they look to improve their positions for a pincer attack from the eastern and southern flanks. At the same time, the Russians also secured the remaining parts of Konstantinopel, gaining full control over the town and kicking the Ukrainians out of it, while also gaining control over the remaining parts of Andrivka and pushing the Ukrainians all the way beyond towards the town of Oleksivka. The Russians gain control over this forest line here in between the center of Andrivka and Oleksivka. The Russians have yet to secure the fortified positions to the northwestern outskirts of the town, therefore the positions of the Russians in the first line are not secure. The Russians will likely look to gain full control over these fortified positions before moving onwards towards Oleksivka to secure the northern flanks and to prepare for further offensive operations to the rear of the Ukrainian forces. However, the Russians also have positions in the forest lines to the north of these fortified positions. This means they can launch a pincer maneuver to encircle the Ukrainian forces from the northern and southern flanks. This will, however, be challenging for the Russian forces, as their positions to the south is located on the low ground and the Ukrainians are within the fortified positions, giving them an advantage. However, from the northern flank, the Russians will be able to have a leveled ground. This means that the Ukrainians lose their geographical advantages, and they can also flank the Ukrainian forces from the rear. However, the Russians have yet to establish proper supply lines for the forces in the north. For this, they need to secure the first lines further north, This will allow the Russians to properly supply their forces near the front lines and launch a stronger flanking maneuver from the north, which will support their forces in the south. In the direction of Bohdanivka, the Russians have managed to secure further parts of the town, pushing the Ukrainians to the outskirts of it and securing further positions between Zaporizhia and Bohdanivka, securing the supply line towards the front line of the town, and fighting will continue towards Kotlyarivka, Troitske, and Horyhove as the Russians move onwards towards the Dnipropetrovsk region. Further to the north, there's some back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in the western flank of Pokrovsk. However, there's been no territorial changes over the past 48 hours. To the east, the Russians have managed to gain control over several positions near Toretsk and near Oleksandropol. Near Oleksandropol, following the capture of both Panteleimoniivka as well as Oleksandropol, the Russians launched an offensive push from both of these towns in a western direction, launching a pincer maneuver on the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area from the northern and southern flank. This allowed them to gain control over the fortified positions, cutting off the Ukrainian forces and encircling them to the southwest of Oleksandropol and gaining control over the main highway. This allows the Russians to advance further in the western flank of these towns, securing the western flank for further offensive operations towards the north. It also isolates Ukrainian forces in the southern flank. The Russians here are looking to expand the zone of control in advantageous positions to gain control over these fortified positions. The Ukrainians were forced to withdraw some of their forces from these frontline positions due to the pressure on the flanks, both in the direction of Toretsk and in the highway intersection between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk. The Russians were threatening the Ukrainians with an encirclement of their forces by cutting off the supply routes in the northeastern and northwestern flanks, which would completely encircle the Ukrainian forces in this entire grouping. The Ukrainians then went to support their flanks, weakening their positions within the fortified areas, and this allowed the Russians to catch the Ukrainians off guard through the capture of Panteleimoniivka as well as Oleksandropol, securing the eastern flank and then gaining control of this fortified stronghold. This large fortified stronghold held several Ukrainian units, allowed them to have a secure frontline position. However, with the Russian capture of it, the Ukrainian forces have been encircled at the very outskirts of the frontline positions, and it also significantly improves the Russian positions ahead of the towns of Veltenivka and Sukhabelka. The Russians will then look to advance further northwards, securing the river line to the east and expanding their positions to the south. This will allow them to improve their positions for further offensive operations along the main highway to the north, in the direction of Kilinova to the west, and further north along the northwest of New York, along the high ground and fortified positions overlooking the western flank of Toretsk. Speaking of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to secure the southern district of Toretsk yet again, kicking the Ukrainian forces out of it and pushing them back towards Shcherbenivka. The Russians also managed to regain full control over Kremsky and the area near it, as well as gaining control over the waste heap to the north of Toretsk. With this, the Russians have completely secured the northern and southern flanks of Toretsk, which allows them to launch further offensive operations in the central part. The Ukrainians, due to their lack of control over the northern flank, have started a withdrawal from the northern flank near the stadium area, and the Russians will likely regain full control over the city in its entirety, both from the northern and southern flanks. Following this, the Russians will move on to gain control over the waste heaps in the northern parts of the city, and then move onwards toward the fortified positions on the outskirts and the forest patches in the area, now that they have completely secured the northern and southern flanks. The Russians, through the reinforcements they sent to the city, have managed to stabilize the situation and are now regaining the initiative, pushing the Ukrainians out of the city, and the fighting is now moving on to the northern and western outskirts of it. The Ukrainians still have a significant advantage on the western outskirts of the city due to the high ground and fortified positions on the western outskirts of it, with the forest patch areas in between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. However, the Russians, with the secure control over the northern flank, will significantly improve the positions in the northern parts of the city, regaining full control over this part. This will allow them to push onwards to the waste heap near it. This allows the Russians to have the geographical advantage with the elevation in their favor. And with the southern flank secured to the southern district, the Russians can move onwards towards the western parts of the city, gaining full control over these parts will allow the Russians to move through the forest patch areas and then fight over the fortified positions head on and through the northern flank. And we see based on this that the Russians have secured the northern and southern flanks, which regains them the initiative and allows them to start pushing both to the west and to the north of the city. Now that they have also secured the southwestern flank of New York, we will likely see further offensive operations along the high ground and fortified positions there, which will improve the positions of the Russians to the north of New York and along the river line here in the western flank of Toretsk. And this will generally improve the Russian positions significantly compared to a few months ago, and the Russians will continue their advances towards the reservoir to the south of Konstantinivka, then onwards towards the flank of the Ukrainian positions in the fortified areas to the west of New York. And based on this, we'll see a restart of the Russian operations to encircle the Ukrainian forces in the area. Further north in the vicinity of the Serbets river line, the Russians have improved their positions to the northwest of Novolyubivka as they continue offensive operations along the forest lines and fortified positions in the area. The Russians have not had any significant advances in the area. However, with this geolocated footage, we see that the Russian pressure on the Ukrainian forces does not stop. In the direction of the Usk river line, the Russians have created an additional crossing here in the town of Kamyanka in between the towns of Topoli in the east and Krasny Pershi in the west. This is also within close proximity towards Liman Druhi, which is connected to railways between the Russian and Ukrainian border, as we can see here. Based on this, the Russians will have a proper supply route across the Usk river line if they gain control over Kamyanka. It also allow the Russians to connect their forces from the northern border near Topoli all the way down towards the Varishna. This will significantly improve the Russian supply situation across the Usk river line, with several crossings across the river line and with a bridgehead that is connected from the northern border between Russia and Ukraine all the way down south towards the Varishna and to the northern outskirts of Kupiansk. This will allow the Russians to expand their offensive operations and the western bank of the Usk river line and continue their offensive operations to connect with the forces in Vovchansk to the northwest and develop offensive operations towards Kupiansk in the south. In the Sumy region, in the border area between Kursk and Sumy, the Russians have gained control over the remaining parts of Basivka, gaining full control over the town and advancing further towards Luknia along the Luknia river line. Russians now hold a larger area between the Sumy region as they continue offensive operations across the border to secure a bridgehead and buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian side. The objective of the Russians is to, despite regaining full control over the Kursk region, continue forcing the Ukrainian forces to spread out their forces and have forces located here in the Sumy region to defend against the Russian forces, despite being kicked out of the Kursk region. The objective of the Russians is to prevent the Ukrainians from concentrating their forces in one area. Therefore, the objective is to spread out the Ukrainian forces as much as possible and widen the front line to a point where the Ukrainians constantly have to send their reinforcements and new troops, new recruits to the frontline positions rather than keeping them in reserve for future offensive operations. The Ukrainians, with their own operation in the Belgorod region, are helping the Russians achieve that goal, as they now have a lot of forces dedicated to this new offensive, which is really struggling as they so far have only gained control over one town, which is Liptsi, which is right across the border area and doesn't really have any buildings. Other than that, fighting continues in the direction of Prilesse, the outskirts of Grafovka, within the town of Demidovka and Popovka, where the Ukrainians have yet to gain control over any of these other towns, despite now multiple weeks of fighting. With this, the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces are clashing both within the Kursk region and the very outskirts of it, in the Sumy region, within the Kharkiv and Belgorod regions, in the direction of the outskirts between the Luhansk and the Kharkiv region. Within the Donetsk region is the main fighting taking place, and we also see fighting in the Zaporizhia regions. This makes a very wide front line between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, stretching from the Sumy region in the north all the way to Zaporizhia in the south. There's some shelling and FPV drone strikes between the Russian and Ukrainian forces within the Kherson region, but no direct clashes. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.